a system which took seriously all sorts of capabilities, not just the cognitive, but the creative, the compassionate, a system which deeply addressed the meaning, purpose, agency that has gone missing for many young people, and a system which offered young people the ability to remake a world which is in many ways broken and to refashion societies, economies, organizations. And that's what brought us to Education for Human Flourishing.
As artificial intelligence continues to reshape work, culture, and communication, education systems are being asked to define their value all over again. If the future belongs to machines that can write faster, calculate better, and optimize efficiency better than we can, what exactly are we preparing students for? In a world increasingly driven by automation, the answer may not be more productivity, but more humanity. What if the real promise of education isn't economic at all? What if it's about preparing people not just to compete, but to live well, to form relationships, build communities, ask deep questions, appreciate beauty, and contribute to something larger than themselves? That's the question at the heart of today's episode, and at the heart of a growing international effort to reimagine the purpose of public education around the idea of human flourishing. In today's episode, we step into that deeper conversation with two guests who are uniquely positioned to explore it. Michael Stevenson, Senior Advisor at the OECD, has spent years studying high-performing education systems around the world. His current project, Education for Human Flourishing, asks education leaders to center learning not on economic outcomes, but on what it means to live the good life. Our other guest today is Mark Pearmain, Superintendent of Surrey School District, which is one of the largest and most diverse public systems in British Columbia, Canada. He brings a grounded system-level view of how this work might take shape in practice. Together, we explore the philosophical roots of human flourishing, how these ideas can be translated into classrooms, and what it means to educate for purpose, meaning, relationship, and action. We discuss BC's unique competency-based curriculum, how Indigenous and global perspectives can coexist in modern classrooms, and how systems can start making change, even in the face of tight budgets and political pressures. We also wrestle with the role of AI in shaping the future of schools, and the responsibility we have as educators and leaders to ensure that what we build still reflects what we value. This conversation is the first in a series on human flourishing that I hope to continue to do throughout the year, and it also inspired the creation of the first ever Canadian Education Leadership Summit that I'm hosting alongside Michael Stevenson and the Ottawa Carleton School District from November 26th to the 28th in Ottawa. If you're interested and want to learn more, I'd love to hear from you, so please reach out directly. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Michael Stevenson and Mark Pearmain. Michael, Mark, welcome to the Education Matters podcast. Michael, let's start with you. Where does this podcast find you today?
Well, I'm in London, in England, just come back from France, and remembering recent travels and recent trips to Canada. So though in London, I feel I'm part of part of your conversation as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Mark, and yourself?
I am in my office in beautiful Surrey, British Columbia. Sunny today. I'm looking out the slight wind, green trees, blue sky, and some white clouds. It's pretty idyllic out here.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I would have given the audience a proper kind of introduction to our conversation today, how it came about and some of the themes that we've discussed. But let's start for folks that are unfamiliar with your respective work. And if, Michael, you can start by describing your current role and job for the audience.
Well, thanks, Jason. I work for the OECD and have done for a number of years. And over that time, I've become interested in the purposes, the deep-lying purposes of education. And I've led a project with some of the high-performing systems around the world which has become called Education for Human Flourishing. That work has reached the point of being clear about what we think, and hope there's a chance today to talk about some of that. But what lies ahead, I think, is a process of discussion, refinement, communication, to see how some of these ideas could actually take in the real world and move from papers to action.
Wonderful. And that's certainly what we're going to try to facilitate today, a conversation around just those things. Mark, before we get in a little further into human flourishing, can you give the audience that's unfortunate enough to have not listened to our first interview together a brief description of your career up until this point?
Sure. Well, it's nice to be back. So thanks for having me. I'm the superintendent CEO of the Surrey School District out in British Columbia. We're about 83,000 students and 13,000 staff. Largest in the province, and very diverse. We have a beautifully diverse community, about 180 different languages spoken in our community that just is rapidly growing on a very regular basis. I've been an educator in British Columbia for my entire career. Spent about 20 years in Vancouver teaching and also in administrative roles, and then moved to North Vancouver as an assistant superintendent, and then spent about just under 6 years there as superintendent before joining Surrey, where I currently am now, and have the opportunity to work with amazing people like Michael and others in terms of trying to think through what education can look like moving forward, and how we can take some of those concepts and bring them into the Surrey School District and larger areas as well.
Thanks for that, Mark. So I want to ask you both, I've been raised by educators. My sisters are educators. My brother and I have spent time as educators. So to me, being around education is almost as natural as breathing, but I'm always really interested in what has led other people to become passionate about education. Michael, can you give us a bit of that background? What led you here?
Well, I think there's a kind of formal answer and a better answer, really. The formal answer is that I started out at the BBC in broadcasting. It used to be called public service broadcasting, but I don't think people use that phrase these days. Maybe you're the nearest that anybody comes to public service broadcasting now, Jason, I don't know. And after a time, I became responsible for the BBC's education output. But also its educative output, all the documentaries on television and radio and online. So that kind of gave me the bug. But I think the richer answer is about 15 years ago. I realized that two things were going on at the same time in my own development. I was working by this time for Cisco Systems, and it was all about the brave, bold future of the global internet. And, I was taking switches and routers and the plumbing of the internet, as we used to call it, not very graciously, around the world. So that was me, the 21st century me. And at the same time, my wife and I were beginning to travel around the Mediterranean basin in order to see some of the remarkable ruins of the ancient world, ancient Greece, but particularly the Roman world, Libya, Lebanon, all of those remarkable temples. And I realized that was me as well. That was a kind of older me. And these two concepts of the future and the past sort of came together for me in education. And I began to see that education was both a way of transmitting the best of the past, but also was a way of looking forward to shape, to design, to imagine the future. So I think it was a number of those things coming together that crystallized my intention to stay in education and make a difference.
Wonderful. Mark?
Well, I love the fact that you traveled around the Mediterranean basin. And was essentially educating yourself by actually living it and seeing it. I go back, Jason. I had an amazing experience in school. I just enjoyed myself when I was there. I love the sports. I love the community. But I think if I reflect back, I had an amazing group of teachers. One of them particularly stands out, Chris Georges. This was a person that taught the person, not the course. And so certainly, I learned from him in terms of geography, in terms of social studies and different things that he taught. But I just remember him creating that space and feeling in a classroom where you could be challenged, but you'd also be empowered. And, I don't think I really understood what he was able to do when I was 15, 16, 17, but, he understood each student individually and met them where they were. And I think that experience really resonated with me. And as it carried on, I went through university. I'm a history major as well. So Michael, affinity there when I hear what you're talking about the Mediterranean basin. And it just was a really warm feeling. So I went back and volunteered. And then from there, went into teaching and away I went. I think I got it out honestly as well. My parents are both educators. So my mom was a teacher and my dad was an associate superintendent. So I think I got all the genes coming out of them. But I combined that with the positive experience and away I went. I certainly will say I didn't ever expect to be here in this type of a role because that's not something that I necessarily kind of envisioned. But from the experience of being in school and having that, real mentor concept of a teacher, I think that's really what drove me towards it.
Wonderful. Thanks. So, between the three of us, we have some pretty interesting experiences in education over the years and some quite varied experiences with education. So I'd like to ask you both, what has changed or what is different in the culture surrounding education, the view of education globally? And then, Mark, maybe you can start by talking first about in BC and what you've seen in, maybe not just your local community in Surrey, but more broadly in BC, if you can speak to that, or Canada, if you so choose. And then, Michael, I'd ask you to answer that question with a global lens.
Yeah, I think a couple things have happened. I think, the world went through COVID, which I think was a wake up for everybody. But my observation from COVID is that it really reinforced the importance of schools and it reinforced the importance of education in the fabric of society. Because what we realized and what we learned is that if schools aren't functioning, your economy doesn't really work. And you need to have folks being able to go to work and being able to function in that sense. So my sense is that there was a refocusing of the community on importance of schools and the value of schools and the importance of connection for kids and adults for that fact. What's interesting is that that refocus has also, I think, just in the political side, has had some other spin-offs in terms of folks who have different perspectives on what kids should be educated with or how they should be educated. And so there's an interesting kind of dynamic now where there's certainly more awareness and more understanding, and also folks have stronger opinions on how and what schools should be teaching. In British Columbia, we have a curriculum that is competency based, and so it's really fairly broad based. We've done that work, commenced it long before COVID hit, and so we've got three main competencies: communication, thinking, and personal social. And this is about trying to set students up for the future that's coming. And when I think of human flourishing, human flourishing and where BC is at are pretty well aligned. I think human flourishing takes a little bit of a step that, forces us to think farther into the future, but it isn't a huge change for us. And ultimately, we're still in the implementation sense here in British Columbia, because it does take a long time to implement new curriculum and new ways of doing things and assessments and everything else that goes with it. But that's a space that we're at. I also look at just the global context. We're in a space now that it seems the understanding of different viewpoints and the respect of different viewpoints and the tolerance of different viewpoints, but also understanding how to communicate with you have a different viewpoint, is becoming more and more and more important, especially with, I think, some of the turmoil that we're seeing globally, some of the realignment, some of the change in politics. And so ultimately, these kind of competencies, and this is what I'm excited to talk about today with Michael, the competencies in terms of moral competence and acting in the world that Human Flourishing is promoting, I think actually is becoming more and more important as the world kind of changes a little bit from the way it's been for the last 40 or 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And that's kind of why I want to set this context of what you've seen. And Michael, you've had a very interesting perspective, certainly from the BBC and maybe more of a bird's eye perspective of global education than most of us. So would you, are there any significant changes or maybe dispositions is the right way to say it, that you've seen over the years?
I think there's been a slow groundswell for change, which has been going on maybe for 30 years. But the operative word is slow. And the first word in groundswell is ground. It comes from the bottom. It's taken a very long time for the policymaker community, looking down from on high, to see that groundswell. As a result, the actual change in the world in education has been more marginal than I think it should have been. I recognize everything that Mark has just said. I think all of that is true. But I think we continue to think about the process of education and how incrementally to improve it, as opposed to learning as a way of being, which is a much bigger and older concept. I would love to think that we are now right on the cusp of that moment of change, which the policymakers themselves can now see and want, where we move from education as a process to learning as a way of being. And if that is happening, it won't just be visible in terrific formal education systems, as we often see in Canada, and certainly in British Columbia. You'll see it in much less formal places, like learning ecosystems in Latin America and Africa and Asia. People coming together to transform the life outcomes for very disadvantaged young people in great adversity, so that their lives come to life through learning. And perhaps one of the things we'll talk about at some point today is how those remarkable events and processes, well, it could be in Latin America, but it could also be in Indigenous communities in Canada, might actually come to throw a spark into our formal education systems and change them. So I think not enough change. I'd love there to have been more, but I think I see a moment in time around now when something's happening.
Well, this is certainly music to my ears and that of the audience, which is, really focused on how we start increasing the rate of change around ideas and notions of human flourishing, which we'll get into. But before we, Michael, I want to turn to you and really glean on your expertise in this work. I don't think I've asked a question to both of you. How did you become aware of each other's work? I think it'd be interesting for the audience to know how your relationship came to be.
Why don't I start, Michael? So Michael alluded to kind of high-performing systems. And so British Columbia has been connected to Michael's work at the ministry level, and I'll let him speak to that. But the British Columbia Superintendents Association asked Michael to come and speak to our summer gathering about human flourishing and the opportunity to understand a little bit of the work that the OECD is doing, as well as the Ministry of Education. I have also been able to have just, tangentially connections or understanding of what Michael's been doing just through other connections. I've had the opportunity to go to Finland and Estonia and some of the other high-performing jurisdictions and get a sense of how they work and what they're wrestling with. And so for me personally, when Michael came to BCSSA and spoke in August up at Whistler, it was finally meeting the person in person and hearing a little bit about it, and kind of understanding the interconnections of what Estonia is working on and what Finland's working on and what Singapore is doing and British Columbia. And, there's different jurisdictions in the UK and Germany and Australia as well. So that's the connection that I've had with Michael and the work. It hasn't been kind of as in-depth, I'd say, as with the ministry colleagues, but certainly has been kind of part of the sphere of influence that I've been following as I try and lead Surrey and help other jurisdictions as well.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to go very far in the world before someone's talking about Surrey in British Columbia as an absolutely remarkable, forward-looking system. So Mark's reputation had gone before him for me. And I agree that I showed up in Whistler mid-August. My police statement corroborates totally with Mark's on that. But these last 5 or 6 years, no doubt we'll come on to this, but the OECD has been working with a number of high-performing education systems to think through new purposes for education. And British Columbia has been on that journey right from the beginning. It's moved through slightly different personnel. Different people have represented it over that period, bringing different perspectives. But just as Surrey is listened to in the world, so is BC. And it may be just one jurisdiction amongst a number in Canada. But I think that the way British Columbia has thought about what teaching and learning really is and should be in our times has set it aside in the world conversation. So for me personally, it's been an amazing experience to have gone through this work with British Columbia as one of this core group of innovative systems trying to think new thoughts about the future of education.
Wonderful. So if we can turn to the notion of human flourishing in education, Michael, can you maybe start by defining what it means, human flourishing?
Yeah, I could have a go at defining it very simply, and then just, offer a short argument that stands behind it about why it's important in education. I mean, whether you're talking about Western traditions of thought, Eastern traditions of thought, Indigenous traditions, people talk about the same concepts when they talk about human flourishing. They talk about happiness, about meaning, about relationships, and about accomplishment. And when they talk about accomplishment, they don't wave grade certificates in your face. They're talking about any form of accomplishment that means something to them and to others. So that's human flourishing in a way. And it's a very long way, isn't it, from what education has been these many, many years. Not always, but certainly I would say the last 100 and more years. The high-performing systems agreed quickly that the purpose of education for too long has not been human flourishing, it's been employment. It's been getting young people into jobs, which is important, but it's not enough. And there are a number of reasons why that purpose for education isn't looking quite as shiny as it did in 1945. I mean, education for what employment? Employment very often in an economy which is still pursuing growth at all costs, which is depleting the world's resources, which is driving social fragmentation, which is guilty of chronic wealth gaps. Education for employment differentiates people by putting them through cognitive exams. Not everyone's so good at that, but it doesn't mean they don't get to play in the world game. And everywhere we look, and to some extent as a result of the education system we have built, certainly amongst young people, we see chronic anxiety, mental issues of every sort. And that's the kind of critique that we can make of the education purposes that we've got, education for employment. So these countries and jurisdictions like BC were pretty clear that in future they would want an education system that was closer to the purposes of human flourishing, and which evaded some of the problems of education for employment. A system which took seriously all sorts of capabilities, not just the cognitive, but the creative, the compassionate, a system which deeply addressed the meaning, purpose, agency that has gone missing for many young people, and a system which offered young people the ability to remake a world which is in many ways broken, and to refashion societies, economies, organizations. And that's what brought us to education for human flourishing. The idea that we could offer young people a learning experience which equipped them for happiness, meaning, relationships, and accomplishment, and was built around those principles that I just ran through. So that's the argument in a nutshell, education for human flourishing, and that's what it's about. Human flourishing, recognized globally, but by different traditions in different ways, as happiness, meaning, relationships, and accomplishment.
Can I just add something, Jason, to this?
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, one of the things that I just want to make also crystal clear and foundational to this is that students can read and do mathematics and write. Right? There's certain things that are very basic that we need to ensure that our students and our children have as skills. I think where Michael and where British Columbia has gone is that, if that's the foundation, and then what else? And I think it's really important just to articulate that. This doesn't take away from the beauty of science or, the artistry of mathematics or the team spirit of a musical production. In fact, all of that is foundational. This goes and just puts all of it, I would argue, on steroids, with the skills and competencies to then find that passion and flourish in an area that a student excels in and loves and wants to pursue. So I just want to be clear, because I think sometimes folks think that you're going to literally throw something away and replace it with something else. It's like, no, there's some basic tenets that we all still recognize are incredibly important and foundational for our students, our children, to be successful as they move forward in whatever path they ultimately choose, which I think is what Mike was articulating there. And in the past, it might have just been, the economic path, which is, preparing for a job. Well, the economies are very different now. Kids can do many different things and earn a living and be contributing members of society in a variety of ways, not traditionally the way that we thought, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah, I mean, and to that point, I think one of the real strengths about this approach is it will prepare you for a whole slew of different jobs that we don't even know exist yet. Like this idea of future-ready jobs, to me, never made much sense, preparing students for jobs that we don't even know exist, right? So what's the best way to do that, to educate the entire human? And one of the pieces that I really love about your work, Michael, is this emphasis on human flourishing as a collective endeavor, as opposed to a focus on just individual outcomes in schools. Can you unpack that for us? And Mark, maybe from the district side, about how we're already structuring curriculum to support collective work under the umbrella term of human flourishing.
Yeah, we're really trying to chisel the human flourishing idea. It might seem as if it's about me and you, my flourishing, my individual flourishing. But in actual fact, the flourishing concept has always been inclusive of family, of community, of nation, and of the planet. And therefore, not just of humans, but of all living things. And we're constantly arguing that unless an education is preparing us to think about all of those things and to take care of all of those things, then it's in some way selfish and narrow. But also, education for human flourishing is not to disengage the student or the teacher from the world out there. It's not to say, forget all of that. We take no view on what impact the individual might have on the world. It's all about, your internal qualities and experiences. Education for human flourishing, to that extent, it is a profoundly engaged proposition, and engaged with the challenges of our time. So unless an education for human flourishing perspective is equipping young people to build the next generation of participative democracies, the real regenerative economy, then it's not working. Then it's not enough. So I think in those ways, education for human flourishing is about the individual and the collective and the planetary. And I think the problem we're left with, the question I'm certainly left asking is, who then are we trying to educate? All of that's fine, and I think right, but we are still only comfortable educating the individual. We have in mind in this educative process a young person who we're trying to shape or allow to grow, and we haven't really thought deeply enough about what it might be to educate the collective, something bigger. And I hope that as this work moves forward, we'll move into that territory. But at the moment, I feel we have more questions than answers on that one.
Mm.
Well, maybe if we turn to Mark and at least speculate as to, what that could look like.
Well, when you think of a highly engaged and functioning and successful school community, you have every member of that community collectively working together. And so I'm going to start with the custodial staff, to the office staff, to the parents, to the youth and family workers, to the social workers, to the aunts and uncles and grandparents, then the students, then your teachers, your educational assistants, and your principals and vice principals. And collectively, they are all educating the children together. And it's not just the responsibility of the classroom teacher or just the responsibility of the parent or just the responsibility of the ESW, for example. It's a recognition that everybody has a role to play, and at different points in time will they enter into that. And in some cases, we know the beautiful stories that for some of our kids, sometimes the strongest connection they have in the building is the custodian who says hello to them every day and makes them feel like they're connected. And it shows the importance of that human interaction. So when we think of the collective, teaching each other, that's how I kind of see this playing out. It really starts kind of at the school. I also think of then the collective within the classroom. Michael referenced the individual. Well, we know that when students are able to help each other and teach each other, they build, empathy, they build resilience, they build tolerance, they build adaptability, they gain skills. So again, this idea of collectively working together in a classroom as groups of individuals is another example. So I want to be clear. I don't see this as a really, monumentally difficult task. This actually, in terms of fundamentally what we do in good schools, is already happening. But it is putting a little bit more of a framework in terms of maybe the why behind it. The other thing that I just want to maybe just, articulate is that I think one of the things that is often lost is the student voice in this. So we need to remember that we serve our students. That's why we're there. And what's super intriguing to me is the opportunity for students to start to have voice in human flourishing and their definition of what it looks like as well. I think of artificial intelligence and how that's being in our society and what we're going to do in the school system, how we're going to actually, ensure that our kids are using that safely and ethically and morally. Okay, well, what better group to ask than the students? We can think of it from the adult perspective, but let's actually ask students who are probably way more advanced in using it than we are for their input, their advice, their suggestion, what they see needing happening. And again, I'm just going to use the words of Michael. It goes back to that collective concept where you're not doing it in isolation. As a systems leader, I'm not trying to do this in isolation. As an individual teacher, we don't try and do it in isolation. We, as human beings, we work better when we collaborate and we work together and we can share ideas. And if you just expand that to the entire, body of the system that we work in, I think that's where the value is going to be to make it successful.
Well, thanks for that, Mark. I think you teed me up really nice for the next question I want to ask Michael and you to reflect on as well, especially in the BC context, which I think does this in quite a unique way. In Michael's work, or Michael, in your work, you refer to like 4 worldviews, right, that really shape how young people understand the world or should understand the world, right? The Indigenous, the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern. How can these views exist in a single classroom, in a single jurisdiction, in a curriculum?
Well, they can and they do coexist. in a single classroom. I mean, it's easy to think that those 4 worldviews are laid out over 10,000 years and more of human history. And they represent some sort of march through time. In actual fact, they coexist right now in our world. And in many a classroom, in British Columbia and around the world, no one's asked to sign up to exactly which worldview they adhere to on day one as they come into a school. But young people do come from these different traditions. And certainly you would expect on any issue of the day or anything that any conversation that a teacher wants to orchestrate amongst the kids in the classroom, these 4 perspectives would be brought to bear. The question is, how do we create an environment, a setting, where people of any belief, and indeed no belief, can recognize and respect and build upon one another? And that's the fix we're in, as we sort of tear ourselves apart in the modern democracy about exactly where we're going. We decry other people's perspectives. We think nothing of running brutal advertisements about what the other side think on the eve of a democratic election. And there's no doubt at all that our institutions, our processes, maybe even our values, to the extent that they have come straight out of the modern perspective, the modern worldview of the mid-20th century, there's no doubt at all that they all need rethinking and remaking. The question is how we do that and how we draw on the perspectives of everybody respectfully to build the new. So that's why I think it's vital that we take account of all worldviews, recognize the value of each and every one, and try to draw them together as we design a better future.
Yeah, and I think, in the BC context, Mark, and I don't want to say you're closer to the work than I am for sure, but one of the things I admired about that curriculum was how they really intentionally built in the Indigenous perspective and Indigenous worldview all across the curriculum. Mark, can you speak to that and what that looked like for educators as that was adopted?
Yeah, so, I think when you're talking about truth and reconciliation, we need to acknowledge truth. And so in the Canadian context and in British Columbia, we are on a journey of teaching some of the truth of what's occurred. And, through strong advocacy, through Indigenous rights holders in British Columbia and courage from the government and the Ministry of Education, we now have courses that all students are it's mandatory to take, and we are teaching, what has occurred in Canada to Indigenous peoples. And I just want to be really clear, and there's a long way to go on that, because rights holders, for example, in Surrey, the local history of Surrey isn't necessarily something that we can yet teach, because there's relationships that need to be built with the rights holder nations here, and then that history needs to be shared and also gifted so that it can be taught. So it's a continual process. But I think what has occurred, from my perspective on this, is that it's opened up conversations. And not everybody may agree with the direction, or not everybody may agree with perspectives that are being shared. But there is a space for opportunity for dialogue, opportunity for understanding, opportunity to gain wisdom. And when I think of the polarization kind of what Michael's been referring to, generally speaking, in the province of British Columbia, there is the acceptance of our history. Like, this is what occurred. We had residential schools here. It was an awful experience for Indigenous families and children. Residential schools, in some cases, were still in existence up to the late 80s and early 90s, which is not a long time ago. And there's past trauma for Indigenous families. And as such, our system has to and continues to need to adapt how we do things in acknowledgement of some of those past traumas of individuals, which is passed on through generations to generations. And if we think of flourishing of young people, you need to recognize that if families have intergenerational trauma from a system or from a previous system, then the current system needs to acknowledge and recognize and try and meet your students and their families in a place that doesn't reinforce the trauma, but actually begins to reinforce a new path, which allows for students to be successful, to flourish, and ultimately change the trajectory. And so, I think, again, in a very diverse communities across Canada, across the world, it's a recognition exactly that Michael was referring to, that students are coming in with different worldviews, different experiences, different maybe global experiences. And yes, there's a space in terms of helping folks understand how our system works. And there's a space of understanding, let's hear about your past experiences, which will allow us to be able to help you integrate into this system. And maybe the system changes to help you integrate so that you can be successful. And I think for me personally, that's where the opportunity is. I'm not going to say it's not a lot of work. It is a lot of work. And it's hard sometimes, and it can be messy. But there's also opportunity in understanding, if you take a look at your system through another person's eyes and the feedback that they're giving you, it can show you where there are some blind spots that you have that you need to acknowledge and adapt and change and be able to hopefully improve. Again, with a common belief that we want everybody to be successful. And, if I'm using Michael's language, for people to flourish and be flourishing in their life and ultimately for their children's life when they grow up and become adults.
Well, I loved how you emphasized that renewal process of understanding even historical events, right? And I think that is something that is happening beyond BC and across the country. And I've had many of those conversations with folks. And this is probably a good opportunity to talk about some of the 5 competencies, Michael, that you focus on, because ethical competence is one of those. Adaptive problem solving, understanding the world, appreciating the world, and acting in the world. Can you kind of articulate for us why these are so important?
I'll have a go. And just to go back to something Mark emphasized a few minutes ago, we know what we're building on. The foundational literacies, the maths, science, the reading, nowadays the social and emotional skills. That's the foundation. The question is, what do we want to build on that foundation? And that's where we come to these competencies. And just before I say a word about them, just to underline that the thought with those competencies is that they might enable young people to reach to a view of human flourishing around accomplishment and meaning and happiness and relationships. So what are the competencies that go in the middle, stand on the foundations, and allow us to reach for the stars? We thought of 5, but I think perhaps the one you mentioned last, Jason, is the most important. And that's what we've called acting in the world. Finding your purpose, your intent, and pursuing purpose intent through activities that really mean something to you and to others. And in a way, there's a chance to figure that out in the education setting, to pursue all of that, whether it's through academic studies or volunteering, service, sport, or art, or whatever it may be, but then to do it for real in life. But we think that acting in the world should draw on two very important other competencies. One is adaptive problem solving. That ability to take every problem you ever solved that's somewhere else, in some other discipline, and to transfer that expertise into a new problem, maybe a problem which has barely been defined, and to bring to it disciplinary and interdisciplinary knowledge and skills, but also the ability to regulate one's emotions, to stay on task, all of those important things. But equally important, how can you act in the world unless you have an ethical bearing, unless you can weigh the interests and needs of others, those you know and those you don't, so that the way you act takes the fullest possible account of the world as a whole. So that's three. But you could also say that acting in the world is itself just one of three meaning-making competencies. And one of the real emphases that kicked into this work over the last 18 months at the request of the countries was to really focus on meaning-making, the meaning that's gone missing in too many lives. So if acting in the world gives you that sense of meaning through what you're doing, then the other two would be understanding the world, and we've talked a little about that. That's the ability to recognize and reconcile other worldviews, and then appreciating the world. And that, for want of a better word, is aesthetics. It's the ability to see what is beautiful and fine, not just in some great painting, but in the natural world, the beauty of a sunset or of a crystal through a microscope. And to see that beauty and to ask yourself, well, what does that mean for me? How do I frame the world, and how am I prepared to reframe it in the light of that extraordinary experience, whatever it may be? So that's three meaning-making competencies, which those two which stand behind the third, acting in the world. So that, I think, is how we thought about these competencies. But in a sense, what it all comes down to is building agency, the agency of every one of us, in a way that restores our sense of meaning, but actually sets us up to make a contribution, and to try to rebuild, I said it before, what's broken, our organizations, our societies, our economies. So I think that's what's at the core of the five competencies which go together to make up education for human flourishing.
That's wonderful. Mark, from your perspective, what are the key questions that school districts should be asking when it comes to human flourishing?
Yeah, so I think this scenario. So a kindergarten student that enters this coming September of 2025 is going to leave our system in 2038. And so when you think of what society will look like, what competencies and skills they're going to need to be successful and to flourish, what experiences we want them to have, what will AI look like in the day-to-day function of society. Obviously, we can't imagine what that society will look like. But I do know that it's not going to be what it's like today. So if I just take a basic example, if we think of artificial intelligence and how quickly it's moving, it's basically at the first step today. And in 2038, it's going to be very different. And so I think of the fact that, how a student is able to act in the world, to me, means what are the competencies that they need to have? They need to be able to do this. They need to be able to have a conversation, either in person or virtually, where they're learning from one another, or maybe they're disagreeing with one another, but they're having discourse and dialogue. They're going to need to be able to to know how to work collaboratively, both in person and I believe virtually, and those skill sets of doing that. And that goes hand in glove with the fact that they may be working collaboratively with someone who has a completely different worldview from them, and being able to find what is common amongst them with their worldviews. They need to be able to critically think and analyze data to ensure that they're not just taking something from, let's say, an artificial intelligence platform, or maybe it's a book, without actually critically analyzing, is this correct? Have I cross-referenced what the information is telling me? Am I aware of the bias that may be already there from that information that's being provided? And then they need to be able to communicate. And they need to be able to communicate this well. And I think all of this kind of gets into what Michael is talking about, which is as the world continues to technologically change as quickly as it is, and will they be able to recognize what's good for them emotionally and spiritually and physically and mentally for their health? And will they be able to take that time, if there's a beautiful sunset, to be able to actually pause and enjoy the sunset and be able to actually just see the natural surrounding that they're in? And, when I think of school districts today, I think of some of us are working through austerity budgets or challenging budget cycles. Some of us are working in circumstances where curriculum hasn't been modernized. I happen to be in a province where it has been, but there are other jurisdictions where it hasn't. But I believe that when you, as leaders, as a system leader, part of our job is to manage the system as it currently stands, to ensure that the budgets are there, that we're doing what we need to be doing, and thinking forward to what a student in 2038 is going to be graduating in, and ensuring that they have the right competency, skills, knowledge to be successful in whatever they choose to do. And so for me, when I think of human flourishing, and I think of the competencies that Michael has referenced, they align very closely with British Columbia competencies. But if I think of jurisdictions that don't have our curriculum, this is something that actually gives a little bit of a framework for senior leaders to be thinking about as they try and drive their systems forward to prepare the kids for 2038 or 2030 or 2028. And I think this is spaces and conversations that they can have now with some work that's being done by the OECD and with organizations that do kind of have forward-looking systems, which can be used as that framework to drive some conversations and hopefully set up all kids to be able to have that opportunity. And that's the tension that senior leaders play in. We need to be in the now, and we have to be thinking about the future. And the now, whilst incredibly important, can't supersede the work that we need to do to set up our systems for the future to ensure that our kids are going to be successful and flourishing. I think that's a really key tension that needs to be acknowledged. And for me, this work is a place that I can drive some conversation forward.
So Mark, I know we want to ask Michael in just a minute, like, what are some of these high-performing systems doing effectively when it comes to, human flourishing and making this a kind of new kind of paradigm to how we educate and how we view education. But what do your instincts tell you as the locus of change in a school district? Is it like teacher PD, principal PD, or work with senior leaders? Because I do feel that what you just articulated is more the norm, is that everyone is so busy running the day-to-day of their building. Like when you talk to a school principal, and we have all these ideas, we really want them to be this lead learner of the school. But they have so many little things that are taking up their time. Like I think we talked about this months ago, and a number of principals I've interviewed since have mentioned as well that they spend so much time just being a supply teacher in their own school in cleaning up the yard because someone's got to do it, and it always ends up falling on the principal. So that's just a long way of me kind of articulating the situation on the ground. But what's your instinct for where we start to make progress? And then we'll ask Michael as to where he's seen the work happening.
Well, I think where you start to make progress is that you need to actually start having conversations. And so superintendents or directors have the opportunity when they are working with their principals and vice principals to be speaking about management items that have to be done. And they can start to talk a little bit about what they're visioning and what they think they need to be working towards. Because when you really get down to it, if you talk to a parent of a kindergarten student, going into school now, what are they going to tell you? They want their kids to be happy, healthy, successful, have a successful school environment, and be ready, whatever that means, for their opportunities when they leave K-12, if it's post-secondary or work. And so if you actually take that last part, that's the part that ultimately we need to be thinking about in that forward-looking perspective. So if I take it back to Michael came to Whistler. I think it was a very whirlwind trip for you. You flew in on the Wednesday night. You were with us the Thursday, Friday, and you were out the door on the Friday evening. But he spoke about us having to be thinking differently. And that, if we want the world to be a better place, which is also somewhat self-serving for us and for our kids, we need to be thinking not just in the now, but in the future. And sometimes, a superintendent or a director, that is the opportunity that we have to be able to have those conversations. But I don't think those conversations just need to be had behind closed doors. I think you need to start to engage them in your writing. I think you need to engage them with your students. I think you need to engage them in your community. And so if I think of Surrey, where we're really starting to try and take this conversation, is we're using it through the mode of artificial intelligence, because we know we can't simply bury our head and hope that AI goes away, because it's not. And we also know that students are using it. And we know that some of our staff are using it. So if that's the case, let's now start to have the conversation about, well, how do we use artificial intelligence in a way that is ethically strong, that will actually ideally be in benefit of community, and is utilized by students as a thought partner or to enhance their learning, not to simply just have an essay churned out and submitted as it's your own work. Because we know that it's going to continue, right?
Yeah, Mark, and I think that's a great point. I think AI is absolutely eating alive the old educational structure. Everything that we've tested for and organized around assessment is what AI does very well. So, Michael, maybe let me ask you this question before turning over to Mark, so he can ask you a number of questions from the district perspective. And so our superintendent colleagues listening to this can get some insight for their roles. But what role do you see AI playing in this transformational process if we move towards, an education system for human flourishing and not just individual output?
Well, if we think of the AI that we have today, seems like it's all powerful, but in actual fact, it's still only solving the problems that we humans give it to solve. Then I think it offers the best ever shortcut. If you're deploying adaptive problem-solving skills to design some malfunctioning aspect of an organization, then you're now able to get an extraordinary digest of every similar problem that's ever been put through a computer, and to get an analysis of the problem that you're trying to solve. The best ever first draft, the best ever shortcut. And then, all being well, AI can be harnessed in 100 different ways to assist you with the problem that you're solving. The problem is that too often we're not harnessing it, we're caving into it. We're allowing AI to undermine our agency, take away our sense of meaning, undercut all of our systems of human security and well-being. And I think that unless we find a way to harness AI to our deepest human goals, our pursuit of purpose, our pursuit of meaning, our pursuit of agency, then we really will be in a lot of trouble. So the challenge is to hold those two things in mind at once, at a single moment. We both need to, let's just put it in the learning context, ensure that we harness AI to create better processes of teaching, learning, and assessment. And we need to make sure that we build human capabilities which actually protect us from AI and its destructive tendencies in this very precious world. And I find I'm either having one conversation or the other, but rarely both. It's as though there are two interests, two communities of thought, and they're each addressing different issues in the learning landscape rather than coming together to ask how can we use AI for teaching, learning, and assessment in ways that support our human mission and protect us from a world which is steadily undermined by artificial intelligence.
I think that's a great answer. And I think, Mark, and the work that a lot of our colleagues across the country are doing is erring on the side of starting to understand it first, right? I think that's the starting point. And then you can have both those perspectives and those debates. And I know students are eager to have those, but maybe this is a conversation for another day where we really dive into the way that AI is helping reshape, for better or worse, or both, the education system. But I want to provide some time for Mark to ask Michael any questions from the systems perspective.
And Michael, so I think of colleagues that don't get the opportunity to necessarily travel, right? So I know that you've you're kind of all over the place. You're in South America, you're over in Estonia and Finland and different places, and you're seeing these jurisdictions that are doing incredibly well. So my question is really, how do systems leaders who don't have the opportunity to get the exposure to other jurisdictions that is really pushing forward on this? And you also referenced non-systems. You referenced actually smaller communities. How do they and where should they be getting exposed to some of these exemplars in terms of processes to begin to implement this into their system? What are some initial thoughts for folks to be able to continue to get exposed and be inspired, and also to learn from others so that they can start to bring this impactful work into their systems?
3 places to look, Mark. First, look in Finland. Finland took a big step 18 months or so ago to create a national dialogue on the purposes, the policies, and the practices of education. This is the Finland that was best in PISA in 2000 and 2003 without ever quite knowing why. Mm-hmm. Then saw its maths and science scores steadily drift downwards. Not too far, still pretty good, but drifting downwards. And they had the guts to say, let's just open this up and talk about it at national level. And it took a brave permanent Secretary of Education, the most senior official in the Finnish system, Anita Leikoinen, to make sure that that was the debate that has happened. Not an easy debate. People have said, well, what happens to the basics? Are you really saying that kids don't need maths anymore? No. Others said, so education for human flourishing, is this instead of jobs? Did somebody just cancel the productive economy? Well, no. But in a world where Finnish GDP is projected to grow at only 0.5% a year for quite a long time, it seemed to them to be worth asking whether there was another way of nurturing human capability rather than the old way of, education for the jobs of yesteryear. So if you're looking at a national conversation, you'd go and see how the Finns are doing it, and they're doing it right now. If you were looking at where it's actually happening on the ground, you might not go to a national ministry at all. You might go to some quite affluent schools. Maybe there are some of them in your district, Mark, but I'm thinking of a school like Wellington College in England, an affluent school, but one which has been pursuing ideas of agency, purpose, human fulfillment, human meaning, even human love for quite a long time. And doing that not just in one fee-based college in the south of England, but with 45 state-funded partner schools and with other international schools around the world. But that's just the top end of the market, where you can see some of these models already playing out. But just as you said, you might also go to Latin America, where there's an awful lot less money to be thrown at education. But something like Fundación Mi Sangre, which is a remarkable organization in Medellin, in Colombia, learning circles for young people, often very vulnerable in a post-Civil War society. Learning circles where young people sit down with former guerrilla fighters, with employers, with business people, with policymakers, and using competencies very like the ones we've been talking about on this call, though not with those titles. They are seeking to build peaceable societies for the future. And in many ways, the real genesis, the real inspiration for some of the things we've been talking about, education for human flourishing, may as much lie there as they do in our formal systems. And, final thought on this. If you were an education policymaker looking across the whole thing over the next 25 years, you might think, well, perhaps my job just got a little broader, that it's not simply shaping up and resourcing, tweaking the formal education system, our schools, our colleges. But as much as that, it is encouraging non-formal learning of the kind I've just been describing in Medellin, so that young people of tomorrow are grounded in both of those remarkable experiences. Education for human flourishing isn't a million miles from what we do at our best today, but it's an awful lot more learning than we often put into a 9 till 4 formal education experience. Do we need a broader concept that also draws on non-formal learning in order to really create the experience from which our young people will benefit?
And let's just acknowledge, we know that our students are learning each and every moment as soon as they leave the classroom, right? They have cell phones that they might be on social media, they're on vlogs, or on YouTubes, or on TikTok. Like, all of that is happening consistently. So it's a matter of, as you say, recognizing the time and place isn't just between four walls in a school building. I also just want to acknowledge, Jason, for maybe some of your viewers here, some of the criticisms that you sometimes would hear about Finland is that it was a very homogeneous society. It was pretty straightforward. But, the work that they're doing there is also now based off of the fact that their demographics are changing and that society is changing. And so that traditional kind of comment or concern of, well, it's pretty easy when it's a straight homogeneous society is actually a false narrative at this point in time, which is, as you described, Michael, why there's some very courageous conversations going on in Finland. I also just want to thank you for that, because, in many cases, it's hard for the practitioners to understand where to look. And so you've given us, 3 examples, frankly, that we can go and start to take a look into and dig around. There's also other jurisdictions out there. Estonia is doing some pretty neat work as well in terms of trying to revamp their system. Obviously, there's opportunity out in British Columbia. I can certainly speak on behalf of my colleagues. We're happy to share some of the work we're doing. And Singapore is another one that continues to push forward. The other question I have for you is just maybe just a comment on the time and pacing. Because as a practitioner, as a leader, sometimes we're either through boards or through expectations driven to get things done, immediately. And the reality is that as you have seen systems being changed and new systems brought in, they don't happen at a snap of a finger. So what advice would you give to systems leaders who are contemplating, beginning to maybe touch or dabble in some of the competencies of human flourishing or their own version of it? What would you say to them in terms of the timing and the pacing and just right sizing maybe some expectations for how long it would take?
Well, having helped lead this work over the last 5 or 6 years, I'd love to feel that it's a matter of a snap of the fingers and off we all go. I don't think that. First of all, I think that the Education for Human Flourishing framework itself, which can be easily enough reduced, though I hope not superficially, to happiness, meaning, relationships, accomplishment, through adaptive problem solving, ethical competence, understanding, appreciating, valuing the world, acting in the world. That I think is going to take quite a time to lead in. I think it will probably take international action, not just great systems working together, but potentially the OECD, to the extent that it shapes a lot of thinking on international education and obviously runs the PISA assessment every 3 or 4 years. I think it will probably take OECD leadership to put some of these building blocks in place. And I also think that it's going to take more than the framework itself. We've talked about 2 things on this call, but harnessing AI and embracing non-formal learning, I think, are going to be vital. But so there's quite a task, really. But above all, it won't work while it's just a policy mandate. It may be a great policy, but while it's just a policy mandate, I think it's going to, it could founder. And it will take individual institutions on the ground having a go and making their version of this true to their values and their instincts and what their people, be they staff or other staff, teaching staff or other staff, what they want to do. So I think it's going to be now a new groundswell, a word I used at the beginning of this call, a new groundswell that really gets inspired around the human flourishing concept and begins to put it in place in classes, in schools, in districts, that gives us all something to look at and convinces us that alongside that national and international policy-making drive, there is real practical change on the ground that can realize this stuff. But Rome, a favorite place of mine, as I said at the beginning, was not built famously in a day. So I take it that this is a direction of travel over 10 to 15 years, not, as I say, a snap of the fingers.
And I think that's a great message for folks just to hear, because, this is something that you can begin to implement slowly by conversation and creating that culture in a district or in a classroom to start to build it out. So thank you for that. Thanks, Jason.
Well, thanks for that, Mark, as well. And Michael, what I wanted to say as someone with direct Italian lineage, I would say maybe the better metaphor than Rome is kind of the Greek archipelago, which my family are Sicilian, so we were part of that. Just in the sense that you kind of have these disparate but connected ideas. So with that, let me ask you each one more question, somewhat separate but related. Michael, I've heard you speak about connecting some of these innovative education systems across the globe. What would that look like, and how can we begin to facilitate that kind of global participation?
Well, earlier today, I was part of a conversation with 7 learning ecosystems in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa. And the conversation was, we're all pretty good at what we do, and that's why we're here, but how do we do it together? And how can we share our very best practices? And in this case, the conversation happened to be about our old friends' measurements and, proving it to policymakers. But it could have been about any dimension of their work. And there is something powerful about great but still aspirational systems and institutions that stretch over cultural and geographical, even political boundaries in order to learn together. I think that the OECD has been quite good at facilitating that at national policymaker level. But if the conversation we've had today has been about anything where I've come at it from the policy aspect, Mark, because of the work he leads in Surrey from the practitioner perspective, if that conversation's been about anything, it's that the same principle, I think, should hold good at institutional level. And it's about how some of the best schools, groups of schools, facing very similar hopes and challenges around the world, could come together to accelerate the process. I'd love to feel that this could become a way of doing things in education, not just at national, but also at profoundly local level. Maybe that's something that, those of us who think in this way could try to facilitate over the years ahead.
Thank you, Michael. And so, Mark, I want to ask you the inverse of that question. From your perspective, what would you love your colleagues to do with other innovative education systems? And this, part of one of the themes of this podcast too is this Canadian national identity. We don't actually have a federal body, so you can take that globally or even within Canada. What would you love to see happen?
Yeah, I think, we sometimes just get stuck in our own little world. And when you can get pulled out and experience an opportunity to work with other leaders and hear their story, or even actually go and embed yourself for a couple of days in their system as a critical friend, there's real value there. And I think what is really powerful, obviously Canada is a huge country, and so we're very diverse in terms of our systems. There's a lot of similarities, but we're also quite diverse in how we do it. But it would be fascinating as well to have the opportunity to bring or to visit other jurisdictions where you do get to kind of have that global perspective. Because, what's happening in Latin America, for example, from a technological perspective, they may be way more advanced than what we're doing anywhere in North America, because frankly, they've had to, and we haven't. And there's rich opportunity that I think maybe some long-held biases that we hold have to be broken down and challenged by bringing folks in, or us going to see what others are doing in a way that doesn't look like our system, but is very, very innovative in terms of providing education for their students. So I think there's real value there, Jason, and I think that how we go about doing it, that's a pretty open-ended question. But again, from someone who's had experience of seeing different jurisdictions, it's a very powerful and rich professional development learning experience for any leader.
Well, I know I can certainly spend another several hours with the two of you, just learning from all of your experience and from this mission that I'm totally bought into. It taps right back into my my humanistic traditions and back to the literature of Greece and Rome that I love so much. So thank you for your time, and we'll have to do this again. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This podcast is recorded on the Territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Buccheri. Until next time.